You filled up your tank yesterday, $4.30 a gallon. You checked Gas Buddy on your phone this morning. Same station, $4.67. That's a 37-cent jump in 24 hours. Meanwhile, the bread you bought last week for $3.29 is still $3.29. Your Netflix subscription is still the same price. Your rent hasn't changed. Hell, the Starbucks down the street is still charging $5.47 for a caramel macchiato. So why does gas spike instantly while everything else takes weeks or months to catch up? And more importantly, because this is the part nobody explains, why does that gas price spike eventually hit literally everything in your budget, even stuff that has nothing to do with driving? Stick around, because what I'm about to show you explains why a war 7,000 miles away just made your groceries more expensive. All right, let's start with some geography that actually matters for once. There's a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman called the Strait of Hormuz. It's 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. That's it, 21 miles. Through that 21-mile gap, approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass every single day. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, that represents about 20% of global petroleum consumption and roughly 27% of all seaborne oil trade worldwide. Let me put that in perspective. 1/5 of all the oil consumed on planet Earth, every car, every truck, every plane, every factory, flows through a gap that's narrower than the distance between downtown Manhattan and JFK Airport. It's not just oil. About 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade also transits through this corridor. Qatar, which supplies 20% of the world's LNG, has to ship almost all of it through the Strait of Hormuz. So when conflict breaks out in the region, which is exactly what happened when the US and Israel struck Iran on February 28, 2026, that choke point becomes a problem, a massive, immediate, global problem. Now here's why gas prices spike before anything else. Commodity markets are forward-looking and instantaneous. Oil trades on global futures markets 24/7. The second there's a credible threat to supply, traders start bidding up futures contracts. Not because oil is scarce today, because they're betting it will be scarce tomorrow. According to data from Gate Markets, Brent crude, which is the international benchmark, went from around $69 per barrel on February 27th to briefly exceeding $110 per barrel within days of the conflict escalating. That's a 59% increase in less than 2 weeks. The U.S. Energy Information Administration's April 2026 short-term energy outlook projects that Brent will peak at $115 per barrel in Q2 2026 before gradually declining, assuming the conflict doesn't persist past April. Why so fast? Because oil is a globally traded commodity with transparent pricing. When Iran threatens to attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz, every refinery, every airline, every shipping company on Earth sees the same information at the same time and adjusts their bids accordingly. Your local gas station, they're buying from wholesalers who are paying spot market prices that changed overnight. So they change their prices overnight too. Now let's talk about who actually feels this pain, because it's not distributed evenly. According to EIA data, about 84% of crude oil and condensate moving through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asian markets. China receives 37.7% of all oil exports passing through the strait, more than any other country. India, Japan, and South Korea collectively account for another 31%. So Asia got hit immediately. China was importing a third of its oil through this one choke point, and suddenly it's shut down. By contrast, the United States only imported about 0.5 million barrels per day through the strait in 2024, just 7% of total U.S. crude imports and 2% of U.S. petroleum consumption. But, and this is critical, oil is a global commodity. When prices spike globally, they spike everywhere. It doesn't matter that the U.S. produces most of its own oil. If Asia is willing to pay $110 per barrel, that's the global price. And American refineries aren't going to sell domestically for $70 just because they can. All right, so gas prices spiked within days. But your grocery bill, that's a different timeline. According to David Ortega, a food economist at Michigan State University, a 10 or 20% increase in the price of fuel or gas is not going to translate one-to-one to increases at the grocery store. Those costs move through multiple layers of the supply chain gradually. Here's how it actually works. Week 1 to 2. Transportation costs spiked. Diesel jumped from $3.89 per gallon on March 2nd to $5.37 by March 16, 2026, a 38% increase in 2 weeks. Trucking companies immediately start adding fuel surcharges to shipments. Week 3 to 4, suppliers adjust prices. Wholesalers and distributors start raising prices to offset their increased transportation costs. According to analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, oil is an input at multiple stages of agricultural production and distribution, farm equipment, transportation, refrigeration. Week 5 to 8, retail prices increase. Grocery stores start raising shelf prices, but they do it selectively and gradually because they don't want sticker shock driving customers away. Perishable goods adjust faster. Packaged goods take longer. Direct energy costs account for only about 3 cents of every food dollar, according to the USDA. Now here's where it gets really bad, and this is the part most people miss: fertilizer. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, global fertilizer prices are projected to average 15 to 20% higher in the first half of 2026 if the crisis persists. Why? Natural gas is the primary input for nitrogen fertilizer production. When natural gas prices spike, which they did, with European prices surging 50 to 75% in the first weeks of the crisis, fertilizer production costs spiked too. TD Economics reports that urea prices are up over 40% since late February 2026. Urea is a critical fertilizer input for basically all grain production. March 2026. Fertilizer prices spike April to May 2026. Farmers either pay way more for fertilizer or use less of it. Summer to fall 2026, if farmers used less fertilizer, crop yields drop. Late 2026/early 2027, reduced supply of grain hits the market, prices surge. So you're looking at a delayed effect that could hit 9 to 12 months after the initial oil shock. This isn't speculation. The FAO explicitly warns that if farmers cut fertilizer use due to high cost, future harvests may shrink leading to tighter grain supplies and a surge in food prices later in 2026. Let me walk you through how a war in the Middle East makes literally everything in your life more expensive, even stuff that seems completely unrelated. Plastics and packaging. Crude oil and natural gas are raw materials for plastics. That means higher oil prices increase costs for packaging materials. Your food isn't just more expensive to transport, it's more expensive to package. That $3.29 loaf of bread? The plastic bag it comes in just got 15 to 20% more expensive to produce. Chemicals and manufacturing petroleum products are used in thousands of industrial processes. Higher oil prices increase manufacturing costs across the board. According to research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, these costs eventually filter through to consumer goods. Air freight. Several Middle Eastern countries closed their airspace during the conflict, affecting about 20% of global air cargo capacity. Higher value cargo like medicines, aircraft components, and electronics face delays and higher costs. Your prescription medication that gets airshipped from overseas just got more expensive. Ocean freight ships are rerouting to avoid the Persian Gulf, adding days to transit times and burning more fuel. Ocean freight costs don't just affect the products being shipped, they affect the price of literally everything imported. And ocean freight is typically 2 to 3% of the final retail price for manufactured goods. According to Allianz Economic Research, a prolonged conflict could ultimately impact inflation by 0.3 to 0.5 percentage points, and that's a conservative estimate. The EIA forecasts retail gasoline prices peaking at a monthly average of close to $4.30 per gallon in April 2026. Diesel peaks at more than $5.80 per gallon in April and averages $4.80 per gallon for all of 2026. If you drive 12,000 miles per year in a car that gets 25 miles per gallon, that's 480 gallons per year. At pre-war prices of around $3 per gallon, you were spending $1,440 per year on gas. At $4.30 per gallon, you're now spending $2,064. That's an extra $624 per year, or $52 per month. But that's just gas. Let's talk about food. Food prices were already up 3% year over year in February 2026, according to the Consumer Price Index. Morning Consult polling shows that 48% of Americans said grocery prices were higher than expected in March, up from 46% in February before the war started. If food inflation accelerates from 3% to 6% due to higher transportation costs and fertilizer prices, and you spend $400 per month on groceries, that's an extra $144 per year. Add those together, $624 on gas, $144 on food, and we haven't even talked about higher prices for everything else: utilities, goods shipped by truck, products with plastic packaging. You're easily looking at $1,000 plus in additional annual expenses for a typical household. Now you might be thinking, didn't we just go through this with Russia and Ukraine in 2022? How is this different? Good question. Here's why 2026 is potentially worse. According to J.P. Morgan's analysis, the Persian Gulf region is responsible for nearly 28% of global oil production. Russia in 2021 was about 11% of global production. We're talking about more than double the exposure. Plus, Russia never actually cut off oil supplies completely. They just redirected them. India and China kept buying Russian oil just through different channels. But the Strait of Hormuz isn't a policy decision. It's a physical choke point. If you can't get ships through, the oil literally can't get to market. TD Economics points out another key difference. The 2026 disruption could be more prolonged. In 2022, alternative supply chains opened up relatively quickly. In 2026, there's no easy alternative to the Strait of Hormuz for most Gulf producers. The only good news, and it's minimal, is that global demand is weaker in 2026 than it was in 2022. Order backlogs are lower, supply chains were in better shape before the crisis hit. That might cushion the blow slightly. But here's the bad news. If the conflict drags on for months instead of weeks, we're looking at a sustained supply shock that's larger in magnitude than 2022. Let me lay out the range of possibilities based on institutional forecasts, because this matters for planning your budget. Best case, J.P. Morgan baseline. Conflict resolves within 4 weeks. Brent spikes to $85 per barrel, but ends 2026 around $70. Gas prices peak in April, start declining by summer. Food inflation stays contained to 4 to 5%. Total additional household cost, approximately $800 per year. Mid-case, EIA projection. Conflict persists through April, gradual resolution by late Q2. Brent peaks at $115, averages $90 for the year. Gas averages $4+ per gallon through summer. Food inflation hits 6 to 7%. Total additional household cost, approximately $1,500 per year. Worst case, alliance tail risk scenario, Iranian regime targets, energy infrastructure throughout the region. Brent exceeds $130 before consolidating. Strait remains disrupted for months. Fertilizer shortages create crop failures. Food inflation hits 10% plus. Total additional household cost, $3,000 plus per year. As of early April 2026, we're tracking somewhere between the mid-case and worst case, depending on how long the conflict lasts. Now you might be wondering, can't we just produce more oil somewhere else? The short answer is not fast enough. U.S. shale production is increasing, but it takes months to drill new wells and bring them online. OPEC Plus could increase production, but according to J.P. Morgan, their announced production increase of 206,000 barrels per day is economically marginal and wouldn't make a dent in a 7 to 9 million barrel per day deficit. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve exists for exactly this situation, and the U.S. has been tapping it. But reserves are finite, and releasing oil from reserves is a short-term solution, not a long-term fix. The reality is there is no quick replacement for 20% of global oil supply. The market has to adjust through higher prices, which destroy demand, which eventually brings supply and demand back into balance. That's economic speak for prices stay high until people drive less, companies ship less, factories produce less. That's the adjustment mechanism. Why don't governments just do something about this? Fair question. Here's the problem. Governments don't control global commodity markets. They can release strategic reserves, and they are. They can subsidize fuel costs domestically. Some countries are trying. They can pressure oil-producing nations to increase output. They're doing that too. But at the end of the day, if 20% of global supply is physically offline because ships can't transit a 21-mile strait, there's no policy solution that magically makes more oil appear. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, President Trump asked China, France, Japan, South Korea, the UK, Canada, and Australia to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Most nations refused, wanting diplomatic de-escalation instead. The UK offered limited cooperation. China and Russia remain unclear on how they'll vote on UN proposals. Meanwhile, Bahrain proposed a weaker Security Council resolution that removed language allowing the use of force. Translation: there's no international consensus on how to reopen the strait, which means it stays disrupted until either the conflict ends or some negotiated agreement is reached. All right, so what do you do with this information? Because knowing that everything's about to get more expensive doesn't help unless you adjust accordingly. First, understand that this is a real shock, not media hype. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of global oil. That's not debatable. When it shuts down, prices go up. Plan accordingly. Second, don't panic buy and hoard. According to Omnicen, 48% of Americans surveyed are buying bulk items because they expect prices to rise. That behavior creates demand spikes, strains supply chains, and actually makes prices worse. The economists I've cited are unanimous on this. Hoarding makes it worse. Third, triage your budget. Gas and food are going up. That's unavoidable. Where can you cut discretionary spending to absorb those costs? Because if you don't adjust voluntarily, you'll be forced to adjust when your budget no longer balances. Fourth, understand the timeline. Gas prices already spiked. Food prices are spiking now. The fertilizer impact hits in 6 to 9 months. Plan for a year of elevated costs, not a month. Fifth, don't assume this ends quickly just because politicians say it will. Trump said, "The war is very complete," pretty much, on March 23rd. Brent crude was still trading above $100 a week later. Markets don't care what politicians say. Markets care about actual supply flows. Look, I'm not trying to fearmonger, I'm just showing you the math. 20% of global oil supply offline creates a price shock. That price shock cascades through every part of the economy that depends on energy. And basically, every part of the economy depends on energy. This is why wars in the Middle East matter even if you've never been there and never plan to go. Because that narrow strait on the other side of the world determines what you pay for gas, groceries, and basically everything else. And right now, that strait is shut down.